Welcome, everybody. I'm Randall Halle, the director of the European Studies Center, Jean Monnet EU Center of Excellence at the University of Pittsburgh. And I'm joined today in this conversation on Europe by panelists, excellent panelists who will be helping us consider the situation in Ukraine, the questions of security, the effects that the Russian war on Ukraine has wrought on the Ukrainian population, but also the larger security apparatus that's being impacted. I want to begin first by thanking Ingrid Gomez-O'Toole and Kathleen Brett for their help in organizing the Conversations in Europe as a series. Next, and I also want to thank and introduce my colleague, Erica Edwards, our Associate Director at the Center, who will also be joining in here in the conversation and helping move things along. I want to also point out that next month we will have the final conversation on Europe for the semester, in which we will be talking about the upcoming elections, the upcoming European elections. So with that, let me turn to the topic at hand. For those of you in the audience, you are welcome at any time. This is an open conversation. You are welcome at any time to post questions or comments in the Q&A, and I will remind you of that opportunity and will draw you in or bring your questions into the conversations directly. So just to remind everybody, although it certainly has been in the news quite a bit, in February, we marked the anniversary of the war in Ukraine, an anniversary that we could count as the 2nd and 10th year of the war. We recall that the war actually began in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the occupation of the Donbas region. A year later, in 2015, the Minsk agreement sought to introduce a ceasefire in order to lead to peace negotiations, but this uneasy period of localized conflict ended in February of 2022. On February 24, a new phase of the war began with Russia's attempt at a full-out invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian resistance was strong and quickly repelled the attempts to take the airfields outside of Kiev, hampering Russian advance from Belarusia. The battles intensified in the south and the east: Mariupol, Kherson, Kharkiv, Kramatorsk, Zaporizhia. These are all names associated with fierce battles and terrible Russian war crimes. The repulsion of the Russian ground offensive through successful Ukrainian troops and the heavy Russian losses shifted the assault and intensified the Russian air attacks on the civilian population. Documentation of war crimes and crimes against humanity have played an important role in the war, including massacres of civilian populations, civilians forcibly relocated, children being abducted, bombing of hospitals, churches, schools, cultural heritage. And for a population of roughly 41 million people, 8 million were displaced internally, fleeing from battle zones, and then roughly 8.2 million people fled further beyond the borders of Ukraine into Central, Western Europe, the Balkans, the United States, across the globe. There they met with varying degrees of welcome. Polish civilians famously opened their doors, and in Germany, the state revived the system of sheltering established in 2015 with a wave of refugees fleeing Syria and Afghanistan. The global community experienced a significant transformation in response to the war. The initiative led by the West resulted in UN General Assembly calling for a full withdrawal. The United States led an initiative to sanction Russia and drive it off the global monetary system. A number of countries aligned with Russia. Attempts to boycott Russian gas have had minor impact on Russia itself. Disruptions in the distribution of Ukrainian wheat resulted in hunger in vast parts of the world. Sweden and Finland applied for NATO membership, but NATO revealed its own fissures in the process with Turkey and Hungary using this as an opportunity to make political demands, especially on Sweden, but also on Finland. Military aid from NATO allies have supported, but also limited the Ukrainian response. And now famously, ex-president and presumptive Republican nominee Donald Trump has issued unsettling statements about US commitments to NATO and has actually hindered further US military aid to Ukraine. In Germany, the phrase Zeitenwende, a turning point in history, has been used to describe these years. And indeed, Ukraine, Europe, Russia, and the global international order have changed in fundamental ways. To help us reflect on these events and their impact, we have currently two panelists, possibly three. We might be joined by a third. We are experiencing the shift in time, so America is an hour ahead, and we may be joined in a little bit by Svitlana Babenko. But we will turn first to Kseniya Yurtayeva, who is at the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasian Scholars, and is there as an at-risk fellow at the University of Michigan, and she's been there since 2022. In Ukraine, she is an associate professor of the Department of Criminal Law and Criminology of Kharkiv National University of Internal Affairs. She holds a PhD in criminal law, criminology, and criminal executive law from the State Research Institute of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, an LLM in international and comparative law from Chicago-Kent College of Law. The topic of her dissertation was the place of the commission of crimes of international character. She teaches courses in criminal law, criminology, and cybercrime prosecution. Professor Yurtayeva is also a certified trainer of the National School of Judges of Ukraine, and a developer of the course in cybersecurity and human rights for judiciary candidates. In the Weiser Center of Europe and Eurasia, she has conducted research on the topics of cyber-aggression as a method applied in contemporary warfare and engaging in post-truth in shadowing Russian war crimes. She also participated in the Midwestern Symposium, Russia and the Future of European Security in Ann Arbor, a scientific conference on cybersecurity in Ukraine in Odessa. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, challenges of prosecuting and documenting war crimes in Berlin. Criminality and crime counteraction in the conditions of war, again, in Ukraine, and the future of Ukraine and international law at the University of Pennsylvania. And all of that just in the last 2 years. It's been very important and impressive to see the kind of work that you've been doing and continually being engaged. So let me begin by saying, Kseniya, if I may, there's this age-old adage that truth is the first victim of war. But in this case, the battle for truth, for documentation, for control over the narrative of the war has taken on new dimensions. And I'm wondering if you could help us understand how this battle has been playing out in Ukraine, how you see, in fact, actually cyberspace being used here in the war.
Thank you very much for this introduction and for having me here today at the webinar. And yes, this question is very urgent, which you raised today. The truth is one of the game changers in this war, and Russian-Ukrainian war is right now named as the first hybrid war in the history, and some of them also, like researchers and their newsmakers, say it's the first cyber war. And it's important to outline the dimensions of this war, and it's connected partially with the cyberspace because it proliferates to life of every person and breaks the wars, the frontiers of every state, and everybody exposed right now to information from all over the world, also the disinformation that is specifically spread about their war in Ukraine. Thank you very much for outlining the framework of the war in the first place, because we shouldn't forget that the aggression, Russian aggression, started not only from the full-scale invasion. It started 10 years ago in 2014, and it was deliberately set below the threshold of the armed attack. So there is several tactics that we can outline as a part of their hybrid dimension of their modern warfare. So first of all, it will be the possibility to place the war below the threshold of the armed attack, so put it in the gray zone. The second major aspect would be hide the attribution of this armed attack that we could see in the annexation of Crimea, and also in their situation when the situation in the aggravation of the situation in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, when only in the International Court of Human Rights there is right now a battle for the truth to establish that Russia had actually its control over the situation in these regions and the attribution of their engagement. And the third thing, and very important, is justification, providing justification and of the attacks and their legitimacy. Even from the start of their invasion in Ukraine, we can see that Russia was trying to put their all kinds of justification of their actions, starting from the name of their action that they do. They call it a special operation or peacekeeping duties. And even in the last interview Putin to the interviewer Carlson, he was saying that he is not doing the war, he is doing the peace. So this is just exactly what we hear. We can put their direct connection to their to the George Orwell famous novel of 1984. So basically the same narratives. And right now we're in the battle of the truth. Just to put a few examples, because right now I'm studying not only like disinformational campaigns, but also the campaign against the truth in their legal field, because there is a number of the war crimes that have been committed in Ukraine. And I would like to say that Russian-Ukrainian war is the most documented international conflicts in the world right now, because Ukrainian law enforcement, prosecutors' office, ICC team of prosecutors are right now working in Ukraine, and also their other countries are documenting these crimes. But at the same time, there is still problems for proving that there is aggression against Ukraine and the war crimes being taking place in Ukraine. From one side, Russia in the most cases ignores its engagement and doesn't really recognize that it has committed the war crimes. From the other hand, there is certain war crimes that being admitted and being like kind of even advertised in their media and even in the international space. Just to provide several examples of such crimes. For example, in their 2022, there were videos when Ukrainian population were expulsed from the occupied territories because they were considered unreliable. And according to their decision of the occupational powers, they said that it was very humane actions, and they were doing it like for helping the Ukrainian population. But from the if we talk about their international law, it will be the violation of the Post-Hague Convention, which provides their prohibition to movement of their population from their occupied territories, of course, and it would be the war crime per se. The second example is the so-called, as called in the Russian media, and it was being advertised, the liberation of the Ukrainian cultural property from the Kherson region, when the number of their all the exhibits from their museums in Melitopol, in Kherson, have been taken forcibly to Russian Federation. And the forced activities can be proved that these actions were committed by interrogating the staff of these museums and providing, but they were the provision of their legitimacy of these actions were saying that they were these exhibits were liberated by the Russian Federation and set out in their media. And actually, the occupational powers were saying that we are going to return them to Kherson, for example, when it will be safer. But nobody told if they will return it to Kherson. That was in a couple of months liberated by the Ukraine. So of course, we have very little hope that can be returned very in the quick way. Actually, this practice was very widespread spread, the similar practice was spread during the Soviet Union, when the best exhibits from the Ukrainian museums were all moved to Moscow and St. Petersburg. But right now we have the difference is that Ukraine is an independent country, and basically it is diluting all the Ukrainian cultural heritage. And the third example that I might just throw here, just in the beginning of our conversation, is the removing of the Ukrainian population, especially children, to their Russian territory, basically abducting Ukrainian children. And right now we have like certain numbers. For example, we have Ukrainian state established that it's more than 200,000 children removed, and especially 2,000 of orphans from their Lugansk and Donetsk and Kherson regions right now, and they were set out for fast-tracking adoptions by providing these children with their possibility to acquire, not possibility, they don't really in this age, of course, they can't decide this, but they were forcibly provided, set out to become their citizens of the Russian Federation. And we all know that International Criminal Court right now provided their arrest warrant for the Commission for Children's Rights of the Russian Federation, Maria Lvova-Belova and Vladimir Putin, for this action. Right now, they are being qualified as the war crimes, but there is a lot of the markers that provide the identification that these crimes can be considered a genocide. And right now, there is a battle of truth, as you have admitted, how to qualify this crime, and Russian Federation even providing a counteraction to this, to their allegations for their committing these war crimes. They are set out in summer of 2023. The Russian Duma, the Russian Parliament, have set out the commission for crimes against minors in Donetsk and Lugansk region committed by the Kiev regime, as it says. And they said, we are preserving our truth. We are and this is one of the lines, we're going to provide our truth to these actions. So, of course, right now, starting this conversation, we should say that right now, this is the age of privatization of truth. So if we're going to discuss further, there is an age of post-truth, which denotes the circumstances which provide less justification of the objective facts in the public opinion sphere than their emotions and personal belief. And right now, this sphere of the public of their post-truth is developed and influenced not only the vast populations but also a public sphere. And to counteract these crimes, they should be remedied. This is the main statement at this point for myself. So to counter the crimes, they should be believed, and the first further actions can be taken from this point. Thank you.
Thank you. That was quite a bit right away, and I want to turn to Joachim to introduce him and to bring him into the conversation about security. But I certainly think that we'll return obviously to what you've raised, and I'm interested further in hearing, following up with questions about what is the nature of information dissemination within Ukraine. So you talked to us about information that's kind of flowing from Russia and out into the global community. But I wonder how the freedom of information is functioning, or how the dissemination of information to counter what you're describing is operating. And just to signpost something that I'd like to come back to from what you said, it's interesting to consider this post-truth era, and you're also researching and an expert now on war crimes and war crimes documentation. And so the juridical process needs facts. And what you're pointing to for us is here a real conflict between the kind of 1984 inversion of hate is love and love is hate, to a conflict between the need to document and the refusal of language, the rejection of language that makes that documentation easy. So I'd like to return to those areas with you to explore further. But I think first let's turn to Joachim. Professor Joachim Koops is at the University of Leiden in the Faculty of Governance and Global Affairs, where he holds the position of Chair of Security. Previously, he was Scientific Director of the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden, in the campus in The Hague, and also the Dean of Vesalius College of Global Affairs in the Vrije Universiteit Brussels, and the director of the Global Governance Institute in Brussels. Joachim holds a BA in Philosophy, Politics and Economics from the University of Oxford, a Master of Science in European Politics and Economic Law from the University of Turku, postgraduate diploma and common professional exam in law from Oxford Brookes, and a postgraduate diploma in legal practice from the Oxford Institute of Legal Practice, and a PhD in political science. If that international education wasn't enough, a PhD from the University of Kiel in Germany. His research focuses on global security governance, European foreign policy and diplomacy, and inter-organizational relations in peace and security, including peacekeeping, peace building, and with a particular emphasis on the role of the European Union, NATO, and the United Nations. I'm just delighted that you could join us. Joachim, could you help us understand? We just heard from Kseniya quite a bit about the flow of information and the way that the war has impacted our understanding of knowledge in a security space, as it were. Could you help us understand the implications of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine for the European security and defense architecture, broadly speaking?
Yeah, thanks so much. Really happy to be with you. Thanks, Randall, for the invitation. Also impressive language skills there, both your Dutch and German, flawless. Puts me to shame. And when I heard you reading out the biography, I thought I definitely spent too much time in universities, I think. Happy to reflect on exactly those things. And let me just on a personal note say, I mean, of course, there is a lot of political institutional aspects to consider now, security policies, but again, I mean, the human tragedy that is now or has been unfolding for, in fact, 10 years is really again something that is very sad anniversary in many ways. My last trip before COVID hit was in fact to Kiev. I was leading an international evaluation team of the OSCE mission back then, the special monitoring mission that was in place in Ukraine. I mean, the only organization that in this context countries could agree on sending. And we were supposed to also travel to the east. That was not possible. We met a variety of human rights activists, vibrant civil society. Kiev itself reminded me of Berlin of the 1990s. The strength of the civil society presence was simply overwhelming, and have very fond memories of that. So, but that trip also showed the first, let's say, security architecture blow. If we now move on from Ukraine itself to the OSCE. So the OSCE, of course, with the invasion of Russia in 2022, has become entirely defunct. It was the last vestige of an organization that could still play some kind of role, even though limited. But that also dealt a full blow to any hope of those thinkers that emerged at the end of the Cold War, still believing that the OSCE could be an alternative security system that every now and then was mentioned also by Russian policymakers. So I think that is clear, and that kind of option is over. But let me reflect then what happened during the last 2 years. And rightly, again, I mean, this should have happened already during the last 10 years, if not 14. Many security analysts that were familiar with the region already saw the dividing line in 2008 of Russia's aggression against Georgia. So that was a wake-up call for quite a few countries in Central and Eastern Europe, not so much, though, for the big countries in the West. And that, I would say, is the first effect and the first wake-up call that Germany, France, Austria and Italy, but those countries that previously viewed the alarm bell ringing of the Baltic states, of Poland, of Romania, when it came to the threat of Russia as an aggressor, when these Western countries saw this as hysterical and completely out of place and over the mark, that essentially view, of course, shattered down in February 2022. So the kind of hubris, the kind of arrogance also, I think, that were dominant in Western European capitals, particularly Germany and France, when it came to Russia and Russia's threat, that, at least to some extent, was shattered. I'm saying to some extent because what we also see in the last kind of months is a kind of danger of tilting back towards kind of complacency, and old habits die hard in foreign policy cultures and trajectories. But I'll come to that in a second. So the first effect on European security discussions and strategic assessments was, well, we obviously miscalculated when it came to discussions in the western part of the European security and defense establishment. Obviously, in that sense, a slight change of leadership. I mean, of course, size still matters, influence still matters in terms of Germany and France in leading the debates in the European Union, but the Baltic states and Poland have, of course, taken on a more pronounced leadership role when it comes to the dossier of Ukraine, support to Ukraine, but also leading discussions on the Russian threat. So that's the first shift, a kind of reshaking a little bit of the kaleidoscope of power balances and leadership when it comes to that issue. Diminishment of the voice of Germany, certainly, and an enlargement of the voice and importance of the Baltics and Poland. Then, though, Germany caught up. You mentioned in your introduction the Zeitenwende, the big speech by German Chancellor Scholz, which meant we need to now, invest massively into the German military armed forces. There has been underspending since the end of the Cold War. The so-called peace dividend meant money was rather used for welfare systems and so on, which made sense at the time, but now, of course, means also that the military establishment and the military tools and capabilities are woefully underfinanced and unprepared for shifting to territorial defense, because that also was the major second shift, where all scenarios, both in NATO and the EU, were very much externally focused. So expeditionary warfare, counterinsurgency, crisis management, peacekeeping and peace building. I mean, the biggest focus during the second half of the 2010s was still on Afghanistan, but also on Mali, where Europeans committed their armed forces on UN peacekeeping. Now, with the February 22, this changed dramatically. The focus, even though a couple of countries again on the eastern central geographical line of Europe already reoriented their armed forces after 2014, but for Europe as a whole and NATO and the EU, now the reorientation was again territorial defense against the Russian aggressor, rather than scenarios that would involve international state building interventions or crisis management. So that period is also over. And that has, by the way, knock-on effects that are not all positive if we think about the effectiveness in the future of the United Nations system and its peacekeeping tools. The third shift was of course, the reconfiguration of NATO. So the neutrality of Finland and Sweden, a long-standing anchor and policy preference of those two countries, changed overnight. Both immediately sought to apply for NATO membership. It saw clearly as a lesson of Ukraine hanging in between alliances, so to say, not being full member of NATO, not being a full member of a security architecture. The lesson from Finland and Sweden was, this is a mistake we don't want to replicate ourselves. The policy of neutrality needed to be abandoned, and both countries applied. And in the end, also, including Sweden a couple of weeks ago, were admitted as NATO members. That strengthens NATO significantly. It brings a lot of military expertise, but also expertise on Russia as a threat to the alliance. Sweden has never really stopped focusing on the post-Cold War threat of Russia in its military analysis. So has Finland. You mentioned amongst the too many universities I attended was in fact Finland in 2004, and I was back then very surprised that school teachers, university professors were all going to the territorial army and were saying in 2004, well, we have to train for the case that Russia attacks Finland. I thought this was, of course, 20 years ago madness as a German MA student, but history has shown us that that was in fact correct and not mad at all. So reconfiguration, a wake-up call, a reconfiguration to European defense, a kind of change of leadership, balances within the EU between big and small members, and of course the bolstering of NATO and the reorientation towards collective and territorial defense. Now, I'm saying that these were initial trends. We see a little bit of a danger now of that unraveling, and this is the calculation of Russian warfare strategies anyway. They are in for the long game. They are reorientating the entire economy towards a war economy. They can send a variety of minorities and prisoners to the front line, whereas Ukraine, cannot do that and sends younger and younger people now in terms of different mobilizations to the front. So this war of attrition plays into the hands of Russia. And at the same time, Kseniya mentioned it, in terms of hybrid warfare, there is a kind of direct targeting of popular support, electoral support, and even political elite support in particularly Western Europe, but also amongst populist leaders that are kind of security and defense Trojan horses now, if we think about Viktor Orban in Hungary, but also Fico, who returned to power, who are pushing for discontinuation of military aid to Ukraine and actually negotiations, knowing full well that there is at the moment no basis for adequate negotiation. So we're seeing there a little bit a risk of war fatigue, of a kind of pushback on support, and that's also not completely accidental. It's also, of course, massively reinforced by Russian misinformation. And maybe last point, we also see a fault line between France and Germany. Macron is always good to make political stunts. He mentioned that there's a possibility of sending ground troops should not be excluded, only to be rebuked straight away from predictable reactions from Germany. But my lesson is something different here. France needs to also buckle up and needs to do far more if it comes to supporting Ukraine simply financially. So these kind of political stunts also, we see this in different corners of the European Union now, cover up essentially an underperformance when it comes to solidarity and commitment to Ukraine. If you just look at the numbers, the Kiel Institute for World Economics is a very good resource. I can put it in the chat in a minute. They have a Ukraine support tracker, so they track exactly the financial, humanitarian, military support of different countries. And if you go there, you do see that the German Zeitenwende, even though Germany gets a lot of criticism, has translated into the strongest financial support to Ukraine from its side. We have controversies, of course, of weapon deliveries, the Taurus system, for example, which would enable Ukraine massive advantages on the battlefield that Germany is reluctant to send. But the overall contributions is 17.7 billion euros in military aid, 2.9 billion in humanitarian, and 1.4 in financial. And just to put this into perspective, France aid is 0.64 military aid, 0.36 billion humanitarian, and 0.85 financial aid. Well, you don't want to start like this kind of ranking competition, but I think that needs to be kept in mind when we have discussions. And lastly, also discussion, because you mentioned Trump, I cannot resist debate. The myth that the Europeans are underspending compared to the US is just that. It's a myth. The Europeans, the EU institutions, the peace facility of the European Commission, so also the EU institutions quickly reacted, which is normally a very slow oil tanker, but they quickly reacted in converting existing instruments into Ukrainian support. So the peace facility, for example, allows now under policy changes of the EU military aid as well. That was previously not possible. So the EU, together with member states, spends now 138 billion euros in the last period of 22 to 24, and the US a total of 67 billion. So the EU institutions and member states spend twice as much as the US. Then often I hear the argument, even from just the discussion last week with some people from the State Department in the US, yeah, but that's not the military aid. In the military aid, we're still leading. Not true as well. 42 billion euros are spent by the US on military aid, and the EU institutions and countries together are now spending 48 billion euros. So 6 billion euros more. Just not a competition between Europe and the US, but just to make sure this is also part of disinformation, to sow this kind of Trumpian differences between the US and the Europeans in terms of this old argument that if the Europeans don't, or NATO allies don't spend more on Ukraine, why should we as US taxpayers it simply is not true. I would end it for the moment here.
That's excellent. I mean, again, with you, you've raised so many questions, so many opportunities for us to pursue various topics there. And I want to remind our attendees that they're welcome to post any questions in the Q&A, and we'll bring them in here. I appreciate in particular the kinds of numbers that you just provided us around defense spending. We can add perhaps in the defense industry and how that's growing. I heard or read recently that France has grown dramatically in its role in the global defense industry, and Germany, France, and Sweden together comprise more defense production than the United States or Russia, which is falling behind. Those are things that are perhaps interesting. One of the things, though, in that misinformation that you're describing is that it also, Trump's language seems to be compelling a move, at least to a consideration of a European security apparatus that is somehow in the control of Brussels or within the various capitals of the member states, but to accomplish something that had been proposed and turned down in the 50s and 60s is back on the docket, and I'd be interested in hearing perhaps more about your thoughts there. And indeed, I appreciate your response about France and Germany and Macron. Someone described the situation in Macron as kind of leaning out the window to test things by making statements about sending ground troops. Who's going to agree? Who's going to disagree? Germany's going to disagree. If I'm not mistaken, Czechia, the Czech Republic, suggested that maybe there would be a possibility here. So it's a kind of interesting question for us to pose. But I appreciate that you've also pointed to other kinds of impact of misinformation than generally here. And so I might take it for a moment just to open it up into a general conversation between all of us here. Go back to Kseniya and see if you either have thoughts to extend what Joachim has said to us, or if you might want to take up this question that I posed before of how information, certainly Ukrainians themselves are intimately and infinitely impacted by the flow of information at this particular moment throughout the course of the last 10 years and before. And I'm wondering and turn it back to you for a second and see if you have thoughts.
Yes, thank you so much. And I would like to make a short comment to the previous speaker that really there is disinformation can be provided in the different ways, and also there is a possibility to manipulate the information. So basically, you provide the information, but provide several facts that provide completely different meaning of it. And one of their very famous example of their, you just mentioned the administration of President Trump and how they used their manipulative language. And one of their narratives for the post-truth right now, which is used, this is a word that was basically come out from the conversation of the Kellyanne Conway, their helper of their President Trump, who after their inauguration of Trump provided their information that there were the most number of the people present in his inauguration, and she said it was not a lie, it was alternative facts. So basically, after she admitted it in the morning show after their inauguration of Trump, their show moderator Chuck Todd, he said that it's not alternative facts, basically they're falsehood. And this is another way how the information can be manipulated. This term actually, it's interesting because it comes directly from the American politics. But in general, I should say that manipulative language and the disinformation is widely used in so-called part of their informational warfare, which is a part of their hybrid, one of the dimensions of the hybrid warfare. Actually, it's interesting that the word hybrid warfare is not being widely used in the Russian military doctrine, but it's been described in so-called Gerasimov doctrine, who is the head of their chief of the general staff of the Russian Federation, started of 2012, and he is the head of their so-called special operation in Ukraine, starting from the last year. He admitted in his writings, in his article, which is right now widely publicized in the West and being translated, that the informational field is very important in their in the actual warfare, and will be used as their equal weaponry in the future wars. So he published this article just in 2013. It actually coincides with the doctrine of the hybrid warfare that is being developed in the Western countries. The part of this informational warfare, we should say that it's also the cognitive warfare, cognitive operations that are being used for the massive, is their influence not only their one person who would be a target of this disinformation campaign, but the massive cognitive warfare, which is taking place right now. Interestingly, I've been studying their cyber criminality for a number of years right now. And before we were talking about the use of the cyber only in the criminal way, like to commit crimes. And sometimes the manipulation were used, for example, in social engineering, as phishing attacks and other ways of get the sensitive information for the person. Right now, the cyberspace is being weaponized, and it's an important challenge to their, not only for their law enforcement, but more to their national security of the states. Talking about for 20 years ago, it was interesting saying of their one of the very famous American cryptologist and the cybersecurity expert, Bruce Schneier, who said it's the amateurs, they target the machines. The professionals, they target people. So right now, this is happening when the massive cognition is being exploited and targeted. But it's not only the information per se. The cognitive warfare, it exposes the psychological peculiarities of the human cognition, because we are still humans, and there is certain psychological way how our mind works. And their way how the Russian disinformation campaign and be built, they take into account the psychological part of their hybrid warfare that is being commenced. And this way of commencing their disinformation campaigns in the RAND comparison being called the falsehood of disinformation, and it basically used their flaws of their human cognition in perceiving the information. The four basic tenets that are being used in these campaigns are the multi-channelism of their disinformation that is being used right now is with the help of their cyber. Right, we should take into account that a lot of the things that being transmitted in their cyber sphere is being commenced with use of the artificial intelligence as well, and the number of their accounts that being created in the social media that is being widely used not only for communication but for receiving information is being created, and they're by the artificial intelligence tools, and more than even 50%, like 60% even more, is being right now this content is being generated by the artificial intelligence. So this is coincidence of their use of the cognitive warfare and the cyber in this way. Also, the tools that being used by the Russian Federation is the volume of this information and repetitiveness of the disinformational sources, because this is also influence of the human cognition and the way that we accept the information. Sometimes if these repetitive messages come from different channels, or they come from the channels that we might think that they're true, or the Russian disinformational tools create the identities, create the fake sites. They create the journals that might gain their popularity by their artificial intelligence tools as well, kind of to provide that they are being popular in the social media sphere. And also in there is interesting that the way that they command their cyber attacks, disinformation attacks, is there is no need for consistency in their messages anymore because of their number of them, and this also obscures our perception of this informational channels. So this is a big challenge right now, how this can be commenced, can be counteracted. Of course, the Ukraine faced this problem in the first days of their, not only even from the first days of full-scale invasion. Ukraine was had to change its strategic approach to countering disinformation. Ukraine adopted their strategy for informational security and provided informational security as one of the parts of the national security. The part of our Council for Protection and Security of Ukraine was also established the Center for Disinformation. And from the first days of full-scale invasion, they were developed the social media centers and channels that were used for countering fakes and disinformation. And with my colleagues, we studied how they were operating during the first year of the invasion, what means they were using to debunk the fakes and to address some of the social media giants to block these channels that were sending the disinformation, or address, for example, the celebrities so they can stand for their for Ukraine and provide the true information about the conflict. So this is a very difficult problem, and it lays not in their only in their sphere of a technical part, but also in the sphere of the cognition. And just to finish this thought, I would like to say that just in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, one of the targets of the conventional weapons that was being used were their transmitting stations that were providing the internet connection and the television signals in Ukraine. For example, in Kharkiv on the 6th of March of 2022, where I was at that point, there was this case was investigated and prosecuted in Ukraine. One of their telecommunication stations were being bombed and demolished because there was already and in other towns as well, because they needed to stop their transmission of information and their true story about the war, especially in the beginning when it was very much in the hectic stage.
And just to be precise here, much of what you're talking about is being disseminated via social media and not traditional broadcast media. So radio, television is playing less of a role, and social media is playing more of a role, or am I mistaken? Or would you say that it's the same? So Russia today plays a very important role here, or not? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I'll clarify because there was the marathon in the television that was provided from the first days of the invasion, and it was their traditional media that was providing this information, and basically all days of the full-scale invasion. But more people relied on receiving the information from the social media, especially the Telegram. According to their official data, 60% of population of Ukraine started in the first year of invasion used the Telegram. And last year, its number increased to the 80%, because of course their channel, their Kyiv channel, could provide the information about the full-scale invasion in general. But people, for example, being like in Kharkiv, like I was in the beginning of full-scale invasion, they wanted to know what was the situation in their concrete town, concrete city, because it was basically important for their life, and what they could, if they could relocate to certain places or not. That's why social media became more and more important. And right now, people rely on their social media a lot, but in the same time, it's their source of disinformation as well. So it's a kind of two-folded question.
No, it's certainly in our center, we've experienced in our YouTube channels comments by what clearly are sort of Russian trolls or Russian operatives, not even responding to the content, but simply the presence of discussions leads to excuse me, engagement. And so also in the cognitive process that you're describing, it's about civilian populations passing on to each other. Have you heard this, or have you seen this, or what do you think of this kind of messages that reach well beyond borders, I assume, right?
there is in the first, basically the first months of the invasion, actually Ukraine has modified its criminal code because, of course, people by sending these messages about the bombings and where is offensive or counteroffensive, there was the possibility to, because of course we know that Russian intelligence can read these messages and as well. That's why there was installed the new article in the criminal code, which provided the prohibition on sharing this information about the movement of the Ukrainian military force and and the situation in the front if it's not being commented and commenced by the centralized government. That's why it's restricted these messages in one place, more or less, but it also provided, encouraged people to use the social media to provide information about the movement of the Russian forces to the social media as well. So it will be used trying to adjust the situation when all population is exposed, and it can have a reach of these channels and try to encourage the people to use it in the right way, and also sign up to their some channels. Our government agencies are also in Telegram right now, and they encourage the population to sign up to their strategic communicational channels besides their television, because not all their our population had access to electricity at certain times, especially in the autumn of 2022. That's why internet connection was essential for survival, getting information as well, because it was sometimes very important for basically physical survival.
Remember also the reports of, in effect, Ukrainian interception of Russian cell phone usage at the front that led to the ability to sort of move the front as a result of Russians texting and calling home and sharing their positions. These kinds of things are interesting because it's not what we're looking at is not just a full-on assault in which Ukrainians are not agents and don't have any response, but are developing their own response as well in very interesting and elaborate ways. Can we go to Joachim though, because I think one of the things that we're also then talking about here, your discussion, the way that you opened it for us was very, very helpful in charting out the sort of broad security apparatus. But I would just say that much of that consideration is also in the traditional security apparatus and thinking about missiles and guns and borders. But you also started pointing to the way that we're talking about a global war in which the frontiers are now stranger than they have been before. That precisely the conditions that Kseniya is describing to us are not simply between Russia and Ukraine, but are leading to have the goal of in effect success in the war of attrition. And I'm wondering if you might have something more to share with us about European responses, the way the security apparatus is also working in these areas, not just creating more tanks and Taurus missiles, but actually we know that the German scandal of the interception of communication was perhaps to be understood as part of this kind of cyber war, this war of information. Do you have thoughts there?
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, a war of this dimension, both in terms of in the most negative sense, level of ambition of Russia. It is not just a war, a devastating genocidal war waged on and against Ukraine. It is also, of course, goes further than that. It is supposed to redraw the entire map and security architecture of Europe and the Western Alliance. So that's also why it is, not only against Ukraine, not only against Europe, it's also involving, of course, the US. And by extension, the entire so-called Western-led liberal international order. We can, of course, discuss to what extent that ever existed, and whether the West also is at fault for undermining it. But it's one of those things where you now see the global dimension of engagement having its limits, right? I mean, it was a wake-up call in March 2022 when in the UN General Assembly, a US-sponsored resolution with full support of the European Union countries, of course, was put forward to condemn in strong terms Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And all of a sudden, Europeans realized that a variety of countries that they thought were in their back, so to say, and were strategic partners even for decades, did not vote alongside. India, for example, a variety of African countries were who were strategic partners, including South Africa, Latin American countries, and so on. So the wider global dimension was all of a sudden also clear that there was a lot of work to be done for Europeans to and the Americans at the global level, which are the ramifications and implications of Russia's onslaught here. So it's also part of a complete systemic competition and redrawing of the international order as we know it since in the Second World War. So just as a quick side note, when we think about war of attrition, and if we think about what is at stake, there is also a war of attrition, so to say, on the enemies of the existing international order. And I'm not saying that the Western liberal or Western dominated international order was flawless or did not lead to injustices, violence, and atrocities. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done for living up to our values and standards that we hold so dearly, but often also not really followed through. And the charge of hypocrisy, of course, often rings true from the so-called global South, even though there's also a hypocrisy of hypocrisy, I think, that we need to consider. I mean, those countries that point out the flaws and weaknesses of the Western countries not adhering to their own values. It's not that those countries criticizing us surpass us in that, but just to keep that in mind. Now, on the points that you referred to now, yes, of course, a war of that scale also lays bare and puts the spotlight on all kinds of fault lines and weaknesses in different security apparatuses that you normally don't see that massively exposed, let's say, during expeditionary warfare, peacekeeping, peace building. I mean, these are normally often situations where countries can influence a lot on how much they want to commit, to what extent they want to go into certain risky areas, and normally they never go beyond capacity if they send troops to Afghanistan or Mali in peacekeeping. But here now, where it's really the own national security is at risk, the own territory or extended territory of the alliance is threatened, and you are essentially in a war situation, I think that's still also the kind of cognitive dissonance that policymakers and security analysts and members of the military in Europe and Western Europe know, that actually we are in a war situation, yet life goes on, and often, with a few exceptions, Netherlands, the High Command Chief of Staff in the Netherlands and in Sweden a couple of months ago initiated a discussion by saying, we're actually in a war situation, and our population needs to understand that as well. And we need to actually, it's not just a faraway conflict, it is an onslaught on the entirety of Europe. And this kind of situation, of course, lays bare problems, fault lines, lack of professionalism, major mistakes that have huge implications. So in Germany, indeed, the scandal now of non-secure communication between really high-level officers discussing implications of the Taurus weapons and its use on Russian territory embarrassed the security apparatus of Germany. It undermined also confidence in Germany by allies. So it reinforced, by the way, some skepticism that the Four Eyes Alliance, for example, or US and UK normally have when it's about sharing very sensitive information with the Germans. I mean, there's now this kind of saying that if you want secrets to be revealed, pass them on to the Germans. not entirely fair, but you see where it's going in terms of reputation, fault lines, and the level of professionalism and streamlined capabilities that you have to have. I mean, German Defense Minister Pistorius now mentioned that Germany needs to become kriegstüchtig, so, you know, capable of war fighting, which, of course, with all the historical baggage and the dimension and the normal non-militarism of German culture, strategic culture after the Second World War is again another step of the Zeitenwende. But it also translates into making sure you have a military and a military leadership that actually is taking much needed reform seriously, and that Germany not only takes a position of leadership in security and defense in Europe again, but also is seen as a reliable, trustworthy, and at least to minimum standards, professional partner in this. So so that remains a challenge, and really requires also really extensive mind shift, because I think neither in the populations nor in some corners of Western European defense elites has it really arrived yet that we're already essentially in a war situation ourselves, where we ourselves the target as well.
I think it was interesting in your introduction, you described the way that the Russian economy has become a war economy, whereas that's not the case in the United States or in the West. It's certainly the case in Ukraine. And the resilience of the Ukrainian economy is something that's certainly impressing everybody, in the way that Ukraine has also become a leading place of experimenting with drones and developing its own technology, partly in response, if I'm not misunderstanding, to the restrictions that come with military aid from other countries. So you can't go into Russia. The attacks that are taking place now, the yesterday's attack on the oil field, it seems to have been a drone attack that was done with Ukrainian-produced weaponry. Where am I trying to ask? I guess the difference here, back to the difference between having a war economy and a not war economy, is perhaps something that assists Russia in its own strategizing. That perhaps the sense is in Central and Western Europe, this is, as long as it's over there, it's okay. But it shouldn't, whatever we do shouldn't disrupt my life here. And I think probably the further west and south you go in Europe, the more you might find that kind of sentiment. Or am I mistaken?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think we also, again, particularly in the first year since the attack, I mean, we do have to acknowledge the huge transformations that countries, including Germany, did when it came also to, complete diversification of investment, reinvesting from Russia, which was a major economic partner, importing, oil and gas, the entire energy transformation, which analysts kept on saying before 2022, and this would take 10 years max minimum. This was achieved within 7-8 months in terms of really decreasing the dependence. So energy security, diversification, then also economic relations, sanctions that to a certain extent have of course also negative effects on those countries that are actually putting the sanctions on Russia. I mean, there are also unfortunate cases of French and German companies circumventing the sanctions. That's a different story. That also belongs to a question of warfare. You need to make sure that everyone follows essentially there on the sanctions side your line. But I mean, I think credit where credit is due. There, the Europeans really have reacted steadfastly, rigorously, and with impressive speed and resolve. But of course, you also need to find the balance. You still have your voters, you still have elections, particularly this year extensively. And what you don't want to do, you don't want to shoot also in terms of doing what Russia is doing now is of course out of the question. And to a certain extent, you also want to make sure that as part of resilience, you continue with your way of life and you defend that way of life. I mean, again, Ukraine demonstrates that also every single day in terms of trying to continue. That doesn't mean that you should live your life as if there's no threat and things just don't happen or happen very far away. And the other difficult discussion and conversation right now is, of course, also where do you draw the next red line? So, of course, we all know, as you know, the public red line since 1949, since the Washington Treaty, is, of course, NATO territory. So if any NATO territory now really is attacked, then the escalation will be massive. But the question is, what constitutes an attack? So does it have to be a physical invasion with military soldiers? It will not happen like that. We've seen how it happened in 2014 in Crimea. We, so-called the Green Men, military people on a tourism almost. It can be already non-physically. It is happening already in terms of cyberspace. So these are tricky situations. And the one worry I have a little bit, and I don't want to paint a bleak picture here, but if we think about historical parallels, and that also only goes to a certain extent, I also don't want to relativize now the threat of Nazi Germany, by the way, causing the Second World War and Russia. But there are some parallels, and that is the imperial aggression and open propaganda every day on Russian media in terms of redrawing and attacking Western Europe, moving the borders again back to not only Soviet space, pre-Soviet, but Imperial Russia territory, is, and also in its violence and in its, as you mentioned now, the kind of shifting into the war economy, with also economic gains of occupation planned in. That's also something that we often ignore. I mean, there are far-reaching plans of economically benefiting from Ukrainian occupation for Russian business interests in a variety of ways. And the response is not proportionate what we saw in the eve of the Second World War. Of course, everyone tries to prevent now an outbreak of large-scale war, but the resolve of the Western alliance to try to think through scenarios where the threat becomes even more acute and what our response will be, that is, of course, uncomfortable thinking, but really necessary thinking in terms of thinking about the next steps, the next level of escalation. That said, we now have a situation that is unlike the Second World War because we have nuclear weapons, we have nuclear powers. There's also a difference of strategic threat perception amongst European countries, including Ukraine. Again, Baltic states, Finland, Central Eastern European states see it as a bluff, what Putin is threatening, and part of the Russian, typical Russian game. Western European countries, and as we saw also, we don't know what that's again disinformation or not, but in the New York Times article that was released now that Biden had at some stage last autumn a kind of a feeling of the likelihood of nuclear weapons maybe being used. So that's, of course, the qualitatively different factor, but how you handle that and how you prepare for different scenarios and what are you prepared, how you prepared to react, still requires quite a lot of hard thinking. And it goes as last point also to what you said about France, Macron's, test balloon statement about ground troops. Some analysts have also said, well, it's also maintaining some kind of strategic ambiguity. So not to lay down the cards completely and lay open what the resolve of European countries are in the next stage of escalation, because at the moment, this dynamic is always very reactive. So essentially, our strategy is always to wait, what is Putin doing next, and thinking about it, rather than thinking, well, what should we do next? What is actually the Western's next step and strategy to deal with this threat?
Erica, you wanted to join in?
Yeah. Hold on, I'm not muted. Okay. I wanted to take it back to the role of political parties, and particularly these particularly populist parties in the West, well, populist parties in general, but populist parties in the West in particular, and just to kind of see or kind of gauge your ideas in terms of, in terms of their message. Are they indeed the voice of the people? Are they channeling what Western Europeans think in terms of disengagement in Ukraine? Or is it just the leaders of these parties who are, rattling swords and whatnot and stirring the pot? And then regardless of what the outcome is, still that they're saying something, right? And I want to know, I guess my question is, to what extent are they therefore influencing the mainstream parties and the ultimate positions that these countries in the West are taking vis-a-vis their, whether it be military support or financial support of Ukraine?
And maybe it could be either of our colleagues.
Yes, that wasn't towards any particular person.
I can also respond to this question. Of course, it's understandable that without international support, Ukraine won't be able to resist their in this and kind of go on successful in this war. And of course, their support of the international community, it's very important. Of course, we can see that there is a battle of the conservative parties, not only in the United States, but also in other European nations. And we can see different viewpoints, and some of them are clearly have connections to their previous or or kind of proven narratives that they approve the actions of the Russian Federation. That's why it's very disturbing, of course. In the other sense, we can say that the whole, in general, the war in Ukraine have changed their international landscape, security landscape, and when they're state, which is their permanent member of the United Security Council, United Nations, it commands the war. And what is the response? And the response is all possible right now responses. For example, United for Peace resolutions, veto resolutions of the General Assembly is being implemented. But we could see what would be next steps, and withdrawing the red lines. It's probably not the good thing, because it's providing the impunity of the actions of Vladimir Putin. And right now, if the rest of the world is thinking about preserving its way of life, Ukrainian nation is basically having the battle for its existence. If talking about the narratives of the Russian president in his speech about the unity of the Ukrainian and Russian nations in 2021, he provided, in the beginning, he was talking about the history of these nations, like he also did in his last interview. But in the middle, if you read carefully, in the beginning of this speech, he started to talk about little Russians who are Ukrainians. Here already there is no even such word as Ukrainians, and great Russians who are Russian Federation. So right now their process of establishing this neo-colonial process should be stopped, or it can be promoted not only in Ukraine but in other nations. Because if there is no if we kind of redraw the red lines all the time, if we don't keep up with go with the ambitions of one man who kind of commands the whole security process in the world, it's of course it's the one thing that we of course live in the nuclear era right now, and there is also the concern about it. But there should be other measures how this situation should be resolved. We talked about a little bit about economical situation. It's also a part of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, because they, as a part of the hybrid war, they were the subversive actions in the economical field. For example, in the beginning of the warfare, we experienced the actions of the Russian intelligence who were commenced through the Motor Siege, for example, enterprise, who didn't provide necessary ammunition and the helicopters because of the corrupted experience, or the explosion of the national economy of Ukraine through the corruption. And the actions that been commenced at the part of the warfare right now in the economical field, Russian Federation occupies the territory of Ukraine and goes in trade with the Ukrainian grain, but also bombs Odessa and Izmail ports, not letting Ukrainians to provide to do their grain deal. So this is multifaceted war, and all these hybrid dimensions have to be dealt as their fulls in the complex way. That's why, of course, I will advocate for not taking their ambition of one nation, of the aggression action against another state who is, of course, smaller. So it would be provide the possibility of any state who would like, who has all the strengths, just to invade and ruin other nations. And right now, of course, I should also write the question. There is the question of the genocide against Ukrainian people. I hope it will be developed in the International Criminal Court. And right now, the allegations against Putin and Lvova Belova is qualified as a war crime, but it can be, there is a strict signs of genocide here. And recently, last week, there was also 2 arrest warrants assigned to 2 Russian generals of the Navy and the military force of the ICC right now. And I hope it will provide the development of these cases not only from their moral and significant point of view, but to their actual taking these people to criminal liability, because it's also the way to provide the remedy to the victims and the way to reparations, which is also not being talked about too much. There is a register for damage right now established in the Europe for the damage that Russian Federation have already inflicted in Ukraine. But all these questions should be taken in the complex way.
Thank you. Yeah, I think our politicians are learning the danger of drawing red lines at the moment, and the red lines that keep shifting is not helping anybody. Joachim, I'm wondering, might you also have some thoughts on the question of electoral politics and the way the war is impacting it?
Yeah, of course. And again, I mean, it depends on the different countries, their election cycle, and also, of course, leadership. I mean, electorates can be influenced on that. So it also depends a little bit on the political elite leadership, but also a little bit on, let's say, cleavages that emerged already even before the invasion. So there's a variety of sources on public opinion, on the EU's response to Russia's war on Ukraine. So you can either go to the European Commission's Eurobarometer. So they, every 6 months they survey all European countries' public opinions. And the question has now also been included: what kind of support packages do you still agree with and support? And there, I mean, you see between 70 and 80% of the surveyed people across the EU still support humanitarian aid. When it comes to military aid, or also welcoming Ukrainian refugees, also on the lower 70% when it comes to military support, we're somewhere in the 60% support across the EU. If you drill down by country then, and there are a variety of surveys that have been done by different think tanks on specific questions like who is to be blamed for the war. Is it Russia? Is it the US? Is it the EU or NATO? You see pretty well, not surprising, but differences, clear differences. So countries like the UK, the Baltics, Estonia, Finland, Sweden, Poland are clearly responding to this. That the clear aggressor here, who's to be blamed for this entire conflict, is Russia. Between 87 and 70%. And then when you go into France and Germany, you're already getting into territory that's a bit surprising. So 33% of the respondents in Germany, for example, said that Ukraine has responsibility for that war. 27% say NATO is responsible for it. And when you break it down exactly which parties do they vote for, there is not many big surprises. It's mostly the extreme right, so the AfD in Germany, or Marine Le Pen's party in France, or far left, so post-communist parties in both countries as well. So these are deeply entrenched cleavages that have not just emerged in 2022, but were predictable already before. The only problem is that these extreme parties now get a bigger share of the vote. So particularly in Germany and France, but this is a general trend now in Europe, the defense of liberal democracy against far-right parties are also directly linked to the defense of liberal democracy support to Ukraine. So there is a combined interest, I think, for those that want to defend liberal democracy in Europe and those that want to continue supporting Ukraine and push back against the Russian aggression. That's the same mechanisms because it's the same fault lines and it's the same parties that are essentially undermining exactly that stance. So the far-right threat, the populism from the far right, and to a certain extent also from the left. We saw this, for example, also in Italy. It's a quite high percentage, particularly left, is a problem. Hungary, of course, is also important here to mention, where the percentage of those that say Ukraine is to be blamed for the war is 55% of those surveyed. So that's more than half of Hungarians blame Ukraine for that war. So that gives you some kind of snapshots of public opinion.
We're coming to the end. We only have about 6 minutes left, and there's a number of questions that I would like to ask. I'm wondering, unfortunately, Svitlana wasn't able to join us, and she would have helped us understand something about the experience of migration and the impact of people in rapid forced migration out of Ukraine, and what it means to integrate into societies and to think about the kind of more the human dimension. But I'm wondering, Kseniya, you can certainly speak about your own personal experience. I also wondered, though, in your invocation of war crimes and genocide, we're seeing how difficult such things are vis-a-vis Gaza and South Africa, the International Criminal Court. We already saw in Yugoslavia and Rwanda how difficult it is to prosecute. I guess as a general question, back to what Joachim said to us about the shift kind of from peacekeeping or peacemaking to the current configuration. Eric and I are part of a security studies group in which we've been thinking about, alongside the peace process, the war process. Not that they're opposites of each other. It's not that, in this case, peace isn't necessarily the opposite of war. We would like to understand it that way, but just as there's a process to put peace into place, there seems to be a process that keeps war moving, keeps war in place. And I'm wondering, I don't really have a great question here, but I'm wondering about, is it possible for us to return to the primacy of the peace process, to get out of the war process that we're in? And it feels to me that in discussions about the liberal international order, the international order for me as a structure that began with Nuremberg, that went through Eichmann, the trial of Eichmann, that was about the Geneva Conventions, that actually was disrupted with the invasion of Iraq, and George Bush's kind of dismissal of the consensus of war and how one creates coalitions. It hasn't been about liberal or illiberalism, but about a precarious agreement on how the international order is regulated. And that seems to be breaking up. That seems not just to be breaking apart, but to have broken apart quite a bit. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts, if either of you have thoughts about this. How do we return to peace process? How do we make it possible to prosecute war crimes? How do we actually restore or improve on an international order that is now in shambles in many ways? And either of you, I would welcome your thoughts in the last 2 minutes. So.
Then Kseniya should definitely go first.
Just a very challenging way to do it in the 2 minutes. I would just to say that their structure of the international security system is based. Which was formed after the World War II. It's basically the main aim is to restore the peace. It's actually not about their prosecution of the war crimes. So their peace is the main thing. So to restore the peace, which I would really my objective, like of my life, of my research, of my position as a citizen, is very important for Ukraine. Of course, we should, but but it does not mean that going to negotiation, that should be at some point we would like to lose our territorial independence and lose our people, because we are also responsible for people who are on occupied territories, and we didn't really speak about the occupational strategies of the Russian Federation. And we can't talk about like long-standing peace as it is visited in the United Nations Charter as their long-standing peace cooperation. But in my understanding, if there is a certain agreement, it should go through the justice, because like without commencing the justice and forgetting everything, like should just peace agreement at certain like certain points, it wouldn't provide their legitimacy. It would provide legitimacy for other countries to do whatever they want, and to all the war crimes and people who were killed illegally in this war. So their actions, I wouldn't talk about all the possibilities of the international justice or the national justice that should be done, but it's something that should be kept in mind. The peace should be through the justice. We shouldn't forget about who started this war. It was just rightfully said that a lot of population blame Ukraine for starting this war. It sounds impossible, but yes, unfortunately, the disinformation campaigns come to these actions that one country being attacked by another big aggressive state is right now blamed, and this is blamed for their own actions. So this is the game of their post-truth world. Unfortunately, we should find their complex solutions for this. So the justice don't go only in the legal field right now. It should be contemplated by other informational processes.
I appreciate that.
If I can just add one last quick
Please.
thing on this. So I'm all in favor of, focusing on peace as much, but I mean, then we need to start with the peace formula that Zelensky and the government put forward. It's still incredible how little it's being regarded. He's been engaging with his advisors for the last 2 years in all different diplomatic fora on, even an adapted peace formula. Now it's 9 clear requirements and suggestions. The Russians have never put forward any peace proposal, by the way. So it's a one-sided negotiations, and more outreach and I think knowledge about that should really be carried out. There are now 60 countries essentially in support at the global level of that peace formula. We're hoping that the Swiss government is going to create a peace summit. I'll just put a link in here of the Global Governance Institute's publication by Vitaly Rishko, who actually summarized the entire evolution of the peace formula for those that might be unfamiliar with it.
I appreciate both of you. I mean, I really learned quite a bit, and it's just impressive the knowledge that both of you are bringing into the conversation and helping us understand the complexities here. And I think the idea of peace without justice is no peace is really an important aspect for us to move forward on and to be thinking about how we can accomplish that. So my gratitude to both of you, and thank you, Erica, and I wish us all the best, and Kseniya, to you and your loved ones. I hope peace and security and care right now. Thank you. April 9th is our next conversation on Europe, and hopefully we'll see some of you there.